Welcome back to The World's Last Night. This is James Thayer. Today I'm going to be going from chapters 31 all the way to the end of Genesis, chapter 50. Once again, I have basically read back through all the chapters and picked out what I thought was probably the highlight in each chapter. You could maybe call these episodes recaps, but this will be the final one for Genesis, and then we get to jump into a new book, the book of Exodus. So let's begin in chapter 31. So in chapter 31, God tells Jacob to flee from Laban and to return to the promised land. As he's fleeing, he's overtaken by Laban, who accuses him of several things, including stealing household idols. Now we remember it was actually one of Jacob's wives who stole those idols, and we talked a little bit about maybe what some of her reasonings might be. In any case, the cool part about that chapter was the fact that Jacob gives this sort of epic rant about how loyal of a worker he had been, and likewise how Laban had abused him during his employment. Remember, he changed Jacob's wages multiple times, and it just was like a really bad scenario. But then we get to chapter 32, and Jacob basically fears Esau as he's returning back to the promised land. He prays that God would deliver him from Esau's hand. Well, Jacob hatches a plan to win Esau's favor by sending envoys with gifts ahead. This has always been an issue with Jacob's character, as he always tries to, even when he asks God to take care of something, he sort of uses his own human wisdom and tries to circumvent how God might make things work out in his life. And he never really, I guess, lets go of that until he basically dies, in my opinion. He sort of gets worked on a little bit whenever he becomes Israel, right? He wrestles with God. But he's always sort of doing it his entire life. And it's not a bad thing to use human wisdom in addition to believing that God is going to bring something about. But if God's already told you that he's going to do something, then you shouldn't also have to be fearful about whether or not that thing's going to occur. And Jacob's actions in this case are taking out of a spirit of fear, not a spirit of faith. So anyways, he sends envoys with gifts ahead, and this is the same chapter actually where Jacob wrestles with an angel of the Lord, and he basically has his hip put out and is renamed Israel. So chapter 33, Jacob meets Esau and finds Esau has forgiven him. Jacob says he'll go with Esau, but ends up going in the opposite direction and settles near Shechem. And so this is actually not where God had told him to go. So he lied to his brother Esau. He actually went, I think it was north instead of south. And so he still doesn't really trust that Esau has forgiven him. He ends up going to Shechem. And as you and I know, because we've already read it, bad things happen in Shechem. Chapter 34, speaking of the bad things, you have Dinah, I don't know how you pronounce her name, which is Jacob's daughter. She's raped while she's visiting the town of Shechem. Well, Jacob doesn't really act to try to rectify the situation. Instead, he sort of waits on her brothers to come home. And so we talked about him kind of abdicating his role, I guess, as a leader to actually exact justice, and instead waits on his sons to come back. I said brothers, I guess Dinah's brothers. So anyways, his sons come back and they're furious, and specifically Levi and Simon, they kind of hatch a plan to murder everyone in this town. And so if you remember, they do the thing where they're like, hey, yeah, well, you can become one of us and we can trade and intermarry, but you're going to have to circumcise yourselves. And so while all the men are still recovering from that surgery, they go in and they kill all the men and they plunder the town. And, well, Jacob sort of rebukes them and then flees with his kids. And he basically says, well, you've brought this great evil upon us. All these people are going to come after us, and so on. So chapter 35, Jacob actually demands his whole family repents, which is good. So they throw away anything that was like profane, and they throw away all their idols. And they basically try to repent to God because he knows that he's in the wrong. His family has sinned grievously. These surrounding people have the right to kill them now for what they've done, but God spares them. So he spares them, protects them from the neighboring people. Now Rachel goes into labor and dies during labor and basically has Benjamin, who is the last and youngest son. Reuben in the same chapter sleeps with one of Jacob's concubines, and likewise in the same chapter, Isaac dies, so Jacob's father. And if we remember, that actually reunited Esau and Jacob again because they both bury their father Isaac together. So chapter 38, it's all about Judah and, chapter 36. I skipped way ahead. Chapter 36 is all about Esau's family tree. I don't really have any highlights from that. Chapter 37, we introduce Joseph. I guess we talk more about Joseph. So Joseph basically has this dream that is basically interpreted by his family as his family bowing down to him one day. And they take great offense to this. And so his brothers, have so much umbrage, they make a plan to kill him, but the oldest brother, Reuben, is against this plan. And so Judah persuades everyone that, hey, what profit is there in killing him? Let's just sell him into slavery so we can get some money off of him. So they sell Joseph to the Egyptians, and eventually he ends up being a slave of Potiphar. And in the same chapter, they tell Jacob that Joseph is dead. I think they bring his little multicolored tunic to him. They put blood on it, and they're like, hey, is this your son's tunic? And as you and I both know, it was a faked death. He actually was sold into slavery, but Jacob believes it, and he grieves terribly, which will be an issue for Jacob up until almost Jacob dies. So Jacob 38, it's all about Judah and his sin against Tamar. Now remember, Tamar was a wife of his oldest son. The oldest son dies, so the second son marries her, dies, and basically Judah is supposed to traditionally, to take care of her because she's widowed, give the third son, and withholds him. So she makes a plan. So many manipulators. She makes a plan to pose as a prostitute and actually sleeps with Judah. She gets pregnant. Judah sees his sin, and she bears twins, Perez and Zerah. Now, Perez is going to be in the genealogy of King David and Jesus, which is very interesting. Jesus' line of, his lineage isn't like this pure lineage with only righteous people, as we know. And so, this woman and Judah are both in his lineage. Later down the line, we're going to even see it's not even just Jews, because you have the whole book of Ruth, which is actually a fantastic book. Ruth is I believe, Moabite, so not even a Jew. And that's in Jesus' lineage. Anyways, chapter 39, Joseph, even though he's in slavery under Potiphar, he does very well. And that is up until Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, fails at it because he runs away, and then she basically claims that he violated her falsely. So Joseph's thrown into prison, yet even in prison, Joseph excels. So chapter 40, there's two prisoners that get thrown in there with Joseph. You have the cupbearer and the baker to Pharaoh. We talked a little bit about maybe these people were in here because there was a attempt on Pharaoh's life through the food. They're not sure who put it in there. But Pharaoh's basically displeased with them, and they are nervous because they don't know what's going to happen to them. And they have these dreams. And Joseph offers to interpret the dreams. One gets a good interpretation. That would be the cupbearer, basically saying he's going to once again be Pharaoh's cupbearer. And the other one gets a bad one, which is the baker, saying that he's going to be hanged or beheaded. And Joseph tells the cupbearer that basically, like, when you get out of here, remember me, like, think kindly of me, tell Pharaoh about me. So in chapter 40, but in the end of that, it turns out that Joseph's dreams come true, his interpretation of the dreams is true, but the cupbearer forgets him, so he doesn't remember him. But in chapter 41, Pharaoh has a disturbing dream. If you remember, there are 7 fat cows that are being devoured by 7 emaciated and ugly cows. No one can interpret this dream, not the magicians, no one in the land. And then the cupbearer says, I remember this guy in prison. I should have told you about him, Pharaoh. His name is Joseph. So Joseph comes, he interprets the dreams, talks about there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, and offers Pharaoh a good plan on how to avoid this bringing disaster upon him. And as you and I know, this is actually going to make Pharaoh a king over multiple peoples, and all the peoples are going to eventually become somewhat slaves to him, and he's going to own all the assets and means to production. Kind of nuts, but this plan is going to actually save a lot of life. So Pharaoh likes the plan, and he elevates Joseph to his number 2, or I guess it's number 1, but the number 2 man in Egypt. So in chapter 42, we get Joseph's family are being affected by this famine, and so Jacob tells his sons to go to Egypt and buy food. The sons are very uneasy about this because they know that they sold Joseph into Egypt. And anyways, Joseph recognizes them when they show up, but they don't recognize him. So Joseph begins a series of tests to kind of see if they have changed hearts, but he treats them very harshly this time, says they're spies, and keeps Simon as ransom until they would return with Benjamin, the youngest, who is also the full-blood brother of Joseph. So when the brothers get back to their dad with this food, they also find that the money's at the top of their sacks, and that makes them really afraid. Now, we talked about different reasons, and one of them possibly is that they feel like they're being framed. It's a bad omen because they got the food, they should have paid for it. So, but anyways, Jacob won't let them take Benjamin back to ransom Simon. So Reuben intercedes and says, hey, I will give you my sons, offers up his sons if they fail to bring back Benjamin. So in chapter 43, the famine is so severe that Jacob finally lets them go back to Egypt. And although they're afraid, they find that they are welcomed by Joseph, and they feast, and they're welcomed into his house, and they're treated very kindly, which makes them even more suspicious and fearful for being treated this way by this man, this great, powerful man. Remember, they don't remember he's Joseph. And so it seems off to them, which it is, because they don't know it's Joseph. So chapter 44, we have Joseph sends them back after this feast, but he tells his servant to hide a cup in Benjamin, the youngest's bag. And while they're on their way, that servant runs, catches up to them, and says, why have you done this great evil? They're like, what are you talking about? And they find the cup. So he planted this evidence upon them, right? But there's a reason for it. And so they're brought back, they're found guilty, and Judah actually steps up and tries to ransom his life for Benjamin's life, which is a huge reversal of what Joseph. It's a huge reversal of what Judah was like whenever he decided he wanted to sell Joseph into slavery. So Joseph gets this really great front row seat to see Judah's repentance, change of heart, and maturity, and his willingness to now put himself in the place of slavery to save one of his brothers. So in chapter 45, Joseph can't take this anymore, and this has been affecting him emotionally every time he sees his brothers, but he reveals himself to them. And he explains that basically what you guys wanted for evil, God turned into good. He sent me ahead to preserve life. So Pharaoh accepts all his brothers and tells them to fetch their father and household, and Jacob says he finally believes Joseph is alive. This is upon seeing the brothers return with all these carts from Egypt. And he says, I'm going to go to Egypt. I'm going to see my son Joseph before I die. So chapter 46, Joseph brings his family to Egypt, and is basically reunited with his father. Well, Joseph tells his family what to say to Pharaoh so they might receive land in Goshen for their herds. We remember that the herdsmen are sort of outcasts in Egypt. And so Joseph is getting them really good land in Goshen, which would be separate from the Egyptians, but is still really great for raising herds. So chapter 47, we have Joseph's family settling in Goshen, and the famine gets even worse. And this is what I was talking about previously. It gets so bad that the Egyptians sell everything they have, and they finally don't have anything else to sell to Pharaoh to buy the grain and the food they need through this famine. So they actually sell themselves, and basically taxes are doubled from, I believe, 10% to 20%, if I remember correctly. So they get the food that they need. They're actually very thankful for this. And at the end of this chapter, Jacob says that when he dies, he wants to be buried with his fathers. So back in the Promised Land, that little burial plot that Abraham bought many, many years ago. And Isaac is buried there. So chapter 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he prophesies that God will return his people to the Promised Land one day. Chapter 49, Jacob gives a unique blessing or curse or prophecy. It sort of depends on which son you are, but basically to each of his sons. And honestly, this chapter has so many excellent highlights because there's so many sons. I don't really want to delve into all of them. If you want to revisit that chapter, I totally recommend it, because we talked about basically Judah's always going to have a king on the throne. David came from that line, etc., etc. Jesus came from that line. It's just very interesting to see these prophecies, curses, or blessings actually flesh out and come and manifest themselves throughout time. And then let's see, chapter 50, the final chapter, Joseph dies, and he basically tells his descendants that, God's going to rescue you from this place. And I guess at this point, they're not slaves, so it's really not a rescue, but God's going to bring you out of this place back to the Promised Land one day. And when you go, make sure you bring my bones with you, which is, we're going to find out, because that's the end of Genesis and Exodus, they actually do that. And so next time you hear my voice on this podcast, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1. I look forward to that. Until then, this is James from The World's Last Night.